Thank you. It's lovely to be here, and I'm especially happy to see so many students in the audience. Let me tell you a story. On February 15th, 1717, the 7th birthday of Louis XV, a wardrobe adjustment marked a turning point in his life. Here is the tale as told by a widely read court gazette. Upon arising, Louis was dressed without his lisière, or leading strings, the ties often attached to the shoulders of children's garments so that adults could control their movements and encourage proper deportment. The boy was accustomed to being guided by his governess, the Duchesse de Ventadour, as he learned to navigate the spaces and protocols of court life. But on this day, in the presence of the regent, the Duc d'Orléans, the governess separated herself from her charge, both physically and structurally, relinquishing him to the men who would guide his formal education. The regent proclaimed that both Louis and the state he embodied were, quote, infinitely obliged to Madame de Ventadour, and urged the king to, again quoting, spare nothing in granting her tangible marks of gratitude. The governess then kissed the child's hand and departed in tears. Louis in turn began to sob and remained inconsolable for hours, until she returned briefly and urged him to show satisfaction at being under the tutelage of men. In the weeks that followed, the king cried during visits with his ex-governess and presented her with gifts of jewelry and silverware. This portrait, recently acquired for the collection at Versailles, features a jewel box that not only commemorates royal gratitude, but also posits an analogy between carefully stored gems and responsibility for a child, often referred to as a treasure. This account raises interesting questions about the production of meaning in court society, questions about the agency of images and material objects, about how affective bonds were understood, and about a particular kind of female presence in the rhetoric of kingship. Why publicize the mutual attachment of the boy and his governess, rather than using the occasion to celebrate masculine authority and credit the child with regal composure in his first step towards political autonomy? Leading strings and teary eyes may have been part of the actual experience, but that hardly guaranteed them a place in the realm of representation. These questions are not specific to Versailles, since the court was based in Paris during the minority of Louis XV, but many aspects of the Regency informed developments that occurred after the court returned to its iconic headquarters in 1722. My project seeks to nuance our understanding of a world that can seem dominated by blatantly ideological imagery and a depersonalizing obsession with hierarchy and protocol. I want to explore how the relationship between the young Louis XV and his governess, as constructed through images, texts, and court rituals, shaped the political imagination of a transitional period and constituted a distinctive mode of female agency. Service to the monarch at court was an important way for noble families to demonstrate loyalty and garner socio-political privilege. Among a wide range of positions, the most prestigious were those involving close proximity to royal bodies. And we've already heard about the importance of spatial and corporeal proximity in the spaces of the court. And because kinship was patrilineal and considered divinely ordained, the women who cared for the Dauphin, the heir to the throne, played especially honorable roles. A gouvernante swore an oath to foster the physical and moral well-being of the royal children. Supported by assistants and a sizable budget, she supervised their living quarters and daily routines, escorted them almost everywhere they went, and guided their first lessons in normative values and conduct. Women from Madame de Ventadour's extended family served in this capacity from the 1640s until the 1780s. She began in 1704 as her mother's designated successor, held the position officially from 1709 until 1732, and was assisted or succeeded by 4 women from her daughter's family by marriage, the Rohan-Soubise. She helped her mother care for 2 royal children and took primary responsibility for at least 7 more, a group that included 5 potential heirs to the throne. The life and reputation of a dauphin were bound up with profound anxiety about the well-being of the state. Madame de Ventadour's early career unfolded amid a succession crisis that factionalized the court, unsettled the public, and threatened France's international standing. 3 royal heirs from 3 different generations died between the spring of 1711 and the spring of 1712, leaving a 2-year-old orphan as the sole direct successor of Louis XIV. The child survived, and Madame de Ventadour cared for him through the death of the Sun King in 1715 and the early years of a regency shaped by the competing political interests of the Duc d'Orléans, the Bourbon King of Spain, and Louis XIV's 2 legitimized sons by one of his mistresses. The instabilities of the regency, including war with Spain and a major financial crisis, are too complex to unpack here, but it is important to note that the Duc d'Orléans' public image was highly problematic. While official prints like this one praised him as a virtuous father figure, concerned only with national happiness, many doubted not only his capacity for self-control and wise policies, but even his commitment to the survival of Louis XV. Beginning in this period, the social identities of young Louis and his governess became entwined in a narrative of mutual attachment that persisted through the mid-18th century. It was rooted in 2 incidents publicized by various visual and written sources. The first involved Madame de Ventadour saving the boy's life after the deaths of his parents and older brother in 1712. She reportedly prevented doctors from subjecting him to their standard regimen of bleeding and purging, then assumed sole control of his care at the behest of a desperate Louis XIV. Some courtiers suspected a poison plot and credited her with administering an antidote, and even less paranoid accounts acknowledged her role in maintaining the principal Bourbon bloodline. The second episode took place in 1715 at the bedside of the dying Louis XIV. Witnesses described a moving encounter in which the king thanked the governess warmly for her service, exhorted her to continue, and instructed his great-grandson to profit from and reward her guidance. Almost 30 years later, Madame de Ventadour's obituary called this expression of royal esteem, quote, an eternal monument to the lively zeal and tender, respectful attachment with which she always applied herself to her important charge. Like the story of the birthday separation, the deathbed story turns on notions of emotional investment and mutual obligation. This print, part of a series celebrating the early life of Louis XV, visualizes affective bonds by placing the rhyming bodies of the Dauphin and his governess on the central axis of the composition. She anchors a circuit of gestures that distills a moment of international, indeed cosmic import into an intimate familial exchange. A dedication to the gouvernante that preceded one of Louis XIV's published eulogies summarizes the nature of her commitment. It stresses the honor of caring for the, quote, royal trust, and praises her ability to unite, again quoting, the sanctity of religion with the politeness of the court. It then calls upon her to, quote, fashion his mind, prepare his heart, and imbue his spirit with the first fundamentals of all that forms heroes, monarchs, and saints, unquote. Thus, even though the governess could not participate in the boy's formal education, she was expected to prepare him for that process by shaping his God-given regal qualities into properly embodied kingship. Madame de Ventadour often appears in images of Louis XV as a dauphin and a young king. She typically stands near him, coming closer than any other woman to the locus of power occupied by Louis XIV or the regent. The child himself is an equivocal presence. On the one hand, compositional features like light patterns and framing shapes stress his special status and exemplary deportment. However, the same devices also emphasize his smallness and mortal vulnerability. This tension encouraged a subject position for 18th century viewers that turned on both confidence and concern, on an investment in the monarchy's future and an awareness of its uncertainty. Given the political importance of images like these, and the correlation between social prestige and proximity to royal bodies, Madame de Ventadour's location cannot simply document the logistics of guiding a 5-year-old through elaborate rituals. Rather, it offered a subtle but important assurance that the royal trust is in good hands. The most striking expression of the gouvernante's vigilance was the use of the lisière, the leading strings that Louis wore until the day he turned 7. Present in multiple images and written accounts, this accessory informed his social image to a degree not seen with any other royal children, either before or since. It was probably more symbolic than functional, which is precisely what made it rhetorically effective. Madame de Ventadour evidently insisted on lisières made of gold thread, an eye-catching material that valorized not only the precious child, but also her role in his care. Consider the scene of Louis XV arriving at his first lit de justice, a traditional demonstration of royal legislative authority at a session of the Parlement of Paris. Church officials, the regent, and the governess surround the young monarch, suggesting equally important roles in his formation. We might expect to see him standing on his own for this public embodiment of law. But the leading strings provide crucial evidence of protection and guidance. The gouvernante's substantial figure forms a pendant to that of a richly garbed priest. Her grasp of the lisière mirrors his grasp of a holy water wand, and both gestures resonate with the allegory of renown, who holds a crown above the axially aligned heads of the regent and the king. The group visualizes the pronouncement by a speechmaker at the ceremony that sound values will be, quote, firmly engraved and imprinted in His Majesty's heart and mind. Since this scene is part of an almanac listing a year's worth of holy days, its audience could have contemplated it often, deepening their investment in an official narrative of glorious succession. Madame de Ventadour's vigilance also was articulated through the spatial dynamics of the ritual itself. She and the king's governor, the Duc de Villeroy, sat at the foot of the throne at the lit de justice, an unprecedented place for a woman who was not a queen serving as her son's regent. While we might need to search for her, 18th century viewers, whether at the event itself or perusing commemorative images, would have readily noticed this focally situated, differently attired female body amid a sea of men. Again, her presence drew attention to the child king's physical and symbolic fragility, but at the same time insisted that he was well on his way to becoming a robust personification of the body politic. Indeed, the disproportionately large size of the gouvernante's figure in the print on the right can be seen as an expression, probably unconscious, of a collective need to imagine a stabilizing maternal presence in the new monarch's life. The relationship between Louis XV and his governess also encoded more abstract ideas. The governess exemplified the selfless devotion of an ideal subject. The king demonstrated the sturdy body, sound mind, and generous heart that defined an ideal sovereign, and the gift of jewels made her an early recipient of his generosity. Their mutual distress on the day of their separation resonated with the notion of affective symbiosis that was central to the discourse on kingship. The historian Thomas Kaiser has shown how political rhetoric throughout Louis XV's reign attempted to frame his authority as what Kaiser calls a love contract, a bond of mutual devotion between a benevolent ruler and his adoring subjects that culminated in the 1740s in an effort to fashion the king as Louis the Beloved. I do not mean to suggest that these two people did not share a genuine bond, or that lived experience was entirely dictated by ideology. But we can access the past only through its representations, and imagining the king's body and feelings was always bound up with imagining the state. Even after Madame de Ventadour no longer served as Louis's constant companion, the narrative of mutual devotion continued to circulate in verbal form and may have shaped the reception of the many portraits that publicized his maturation. In 1721, when the 11-year-old king became seriously ill, popular songs praised his gouvernante for continued investment in his well-being. One calls her a mama duchess, picking up on the fact that the boy always addressed her as mother and did for the rest of her life. Another casts her and the Duc de Villeroy as parents who, quote, revived this young and charming monarch despite the jaws of fate. In a more high-minded tribute, a personification of religion reveals that she has handled the health crisis by sending France an incarnation of devotion in the form of, you guessed it, Madame de Ventadour. The poem credits the governess with emotions that surpass maternal instincts. Quote, in her vigil she felt in turn fear and hope, joy and love. A mother for her son would not feel such tenderness, unquote. The governess thus remained an affective model, embodying what all French subjects were supposed to feel. And in 1729, when Louis's queen, Marie Łazińska, gave birth to a long-awaited son, the gouvernante returned to royal iconography as a guardian of succession. In the print on the far right, a striking compositional contrast suggests how her role transcended biological maternity. While the queen recovers in the background, Madame de Ventadour presents the swaddled dauphin to the king, her upright, youthful form belying the fact that she was by then over 70 years old. My exploration of Madame de Ventadour's significance in official narratives begs the question of her own agency in the myth-making process. Let me offer two examples that suggest her active engagement with representational codes. During the final years of Louis XIV's reign, she often discussed the Dauphin's progress in correspondence with Madame de Maintenon, the king's morganatic wife and an influential mediator for those who sought his favor. The gouvernante's letters suggest an effort to shape how her role was perceived. She shifts from assurances about the Dauphin's health to details about his illnesses, from references to her exhaustion to declarations of total commitment, and she often alludes to a sense of political urgency. These moves lead Madame de Maintenon, and by implication the king, to express appreciation for her devotion. In an exchange of 1714, for example, Madame de Ventadour describes the Dauphin's recovery after an alarming seizure, then calls attention to how his strength depends on hers. This is quoting Madame de Ventadour. My pains are undertaken willingly, my vigor is surprising for my age. I cannot reproach myself for the least little care or precaution, and hope they will bear good results. This prince promises all that can be desired in body and mind. In response, Madame de Maintenon urges her to stay well and affirms her high-stakes attachment. Quote, I am persuaded that you do everything for him with a good heart and cannot prevent yourself from doing so, loving him as much as you do and knowing full well his importance. In this communication and others like it, the governess exercised an astute sense of how politics and affect were entwined, fashioning her own image along with that of the Dauphin. An even more remarkable claim plays out in this group portrait. It inserts the governess, grasping the lisière of the child who became Louis XV, into a tableau that summarizes the Bourbon lineage and celebrates its resolved succession crisis. There is no evidence of the painting's commission, and the artist's identity is uncertain, but it was probably made for Madame de Ventadour between Louis XV's succession in 1715 and his coronation in 1722. It depicts a fantasy gathering of heirs to the throne whose actual lifespans intersected, if at all, for little more than a year, and whose heads were copied from prior portraits made at different times. Scholars have tended to dismiss the work as derivative and anachronistic, but I want to suggest that it makes a strong statement about the gouvernante's identity. Most obviously, the painting proclaims the continuity and glory of the monarchy. The composition aligns the heads of the three Louis who lived to occupy the throne. Several hands draw attention to the space where Louis XIV's gesture almost meets the tiny fingers of his sole surviving heir. The decor teems with royal symbolism: the solar chariot of Apollo, the caduceus of eloquent Mercury, the club of forceful Hercules, more of that mythological imagery that we talked about this morning. Even the basket of fruit, although a convention in many non-royal portraits, here suggests what a court poet would call a happy harvest, dynastic fertility, and the abundance assured by beneficent rule. Ultimately, however, this picture is about a woman's role in the transmission of kingship. Madame de Ventadour's black-clad figure is the most solid-looking shape in the composition. Certain elements invoke the two most renowned moments of her early career. The child, not yet wearing breeches, is the age at which she supposedly saved his life. The line of the gold lisière flows into the blue sash of the Order of Saint-Esprit, cords of guidance becoming an emblem of honor. Her extended arms and the angle of her head mirror the pose of Louis XIV, whose gesture of blessing implicitly designates her as well as his heir. Although the composition is less intimate than the deathbed scene, it similarly presents the governess and the Sun King as joint guardians, allied in a pact to assure a glorious future. Moreover, hovering behind this parade of kings is the gouvernante's own lineage. 18th century viewers would have known that Henri IV chose her great-grandfather as governor of the royal children, and that Louis XIII appointed her great-grandmother to care for his sons. One of those boys became Louis XIV and made Madame de Ventadour's mother responsible for his own offspring, you still with me, as well as those of the Grand Dauphin and the Duc de Bourgogne, the two men whose deaths precipitated the succession crisis. In other words, what you need to know is that the painting celebrates not just a Bourbon bloodline, but also the symbiosis of royal trust and devoted service that braided Madame de Ventadour's family into the destiny of France. It also makes an even bolder claim by linking the governess with two other pictorial presences. She stands directly below Apollo, her grasp of leading strings echoing the sun god's hold on the reins that govern an eternal cosmic cycle. Her gender and compositional placement also associate her with a bas-relief of Minerva, goddess of wisdom, armed and seated on a throne. This might be the version of Minerva's iconography known as, quote, force of body and mind, the very qualities that a governess pledged to instill in her precious charges. A number of images celebrating Louis XV's increasing maturity invoked Minerva to celebrate masculine qualities. In this example, dedicated to the king's governor, the Duc de Villeroy, Minerva gestures towards a temple representing the inspiration and immortality of heroes. Similarly, in the group portrait, Madame de Ventadour wisely guides Louis XV to his destiny as part of an exemplary lineage. The painting resonates with an epitaph published upon her death in 1744. Quote, "Her devoted days have passed in illustrious governments. They will mark her wisdom, her zeal, and attachment, which find august monuments in the pupils she leaves behind." These lines neatly capture the interdependence of sovereignty and subjecthood. The governess serves government, which then honors her through the legacies of those she has raised. So to conclude, some of the most influential recent scholarship on the 18th century French court has focused on women whose identities were defined by controversy. Louis XV's mistress, Madame de Pompadour, and Louis XV's queen, Marie Antoinette, attempted to exercise forms of agency that challenged assumptions about how gender roles, court protocol, and political influence were supposed to operate. Despite the elegance of these portraits, other representations stigmatized these women as sexually, socially, and morally unruly forces that threatened royal authority. Madame de Ventadour's identity does not seem to have been contested, but it is no less revealing of the dynamics of gender and power. Operating within the parameters of acceptability, this woman synthesized associations that could not condense in any other role. The regent could not be imagined as a selfless nurturer, not only because that was considered a female quality, but also because of suspicions about his morality and political motives. Even if Louis XV's mother had lived, her love could not have carried the same rhetorical potency as that of a gouvernante. A queen was expected to produce children, but leave their upbringing to others. And if a queen appeared to wield political influence, as either a regent for her son or an advisor to her husband, her gender and foreign origin could fuel anxiety about dangerous control over the king. In contrast, Madame de Ventadour was a mother-like figure with a non-sexualized body that could signify pure devotion. She supplemented the regent without undermining his authority and highlighted a young king's readiness to rule. Her story reminds us to find meaning not only in the grand spectacles of the French court, but also in the details of daily life, like a little boy's distress over a change in his attire on a winter day almost exactly 300 years ago. Thank you.